to destroy the counterculture and political organizing in this country that went against the military-industrial complex, the war machine, the profits to be made by war, and went against any attempt at racial integration or harmony. There were specific agencies involved, both spying on and then infiltrating and disrupting these kinds of peace and social change movements here in the United States. And in many cases, the agents provocateurs that were put into the situations either did killings themselves or led groups to believe that they were attacking each other, couldn't be trusted, and so had people kill each other in these situations. And these things are described in several books. One recent one is Agents of Repression from Ward Churchill in South End Press, who talks about how the Black Panther Party and the American Indian movement specifically were targeted and destroyed by these various methods under something called COINTELPRO, or Counterintelligence Program of the FBI. Now you have to understand that the FBI had taken this role even back at its inception in the 1920s as part of the Palmer raids and the anti-communist scares that were brought up at that time in order to justify the murder and deportation of thousands of people in the United States who were organizing labor here against the interests of the rich and the ruling class. And these same forces, and actually before the FBI became a federal agency, there were these agencies like Palmer worked for in the government doing this kind of spying under the direction of one of the relatives of Napoleon Bonaparte. That individual hired Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, who then rose in the ranks to head up the FBI later on. COINTELPRO came out of a specific division of the FBI that was formed in 1942 by William Sullivan and Cartha Deke DeLoach. These two top men in the FBI for years afterwards came into Hoover's employ from the Office of Naval Intelligence. The Division 5, or Domestic Operation Division of the FBI that ran COINTELPRO, was set up by them for the specific purpose of disrupting internal movements in the U.S. And these two names show up in a variety of political assassinations, but specifically in relation to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And the role of Navy intelligence follows through in my work on all of these various assassinations. So I don't think it's insignificant within that context that a number of the rock stars from the counterculture period, especially those that appeared at Monterey Pop at the end of the 1960s, and who were influencing consciousness and political beliefs with their music, later showed up dead in a variety of violent ways, including the so-called heroin overdoses of Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, the strange death of Jim Croce, and the death of Jim Morrison, the Doors. All of these raise questions when looked at with more scrutiny than they've been given by the press in general. It is in fact impossible to overdose on either pure heroin or pure cocaine, and these rock stars did not have to buy street cocaine or heroin that was cut with anything if they were in fact doing the drugs. They could get relatively pure drugs which would not have caused an overdose. But the coroners in many of these cases are political appointees, and few questions are raised. It's enough to have the scandal that somebody was doing drugs. That becomes the excuse, but there's a string of deaths of the musicians, and perhaps the most political of these musicians was John Lennon. And the most influential group was the Beatles for that period of the counterculture. And Lennon, even after the Beatles broke up, continued in very political music with forming socialist-oriented bands, worked with David Peel, worked with a defensive member of the White Panthers out of Detroit, who had been busted illegally on drugs, and began to make his last albums before he was silent for a long period of time, had to do with labor organizing and the revolt in Ireland against the British rule, and a variety of openly political topics. And the idea was to use these albums and his popularity to raise money for political causes and for movement work. In fact, it was Yoko Ono and John Lennon who financed Paul Krassner's realist issue when he was broke where the information on Watergate first broke nationally in an article by researcher Mae Brussel, who I worked with. And that issue would never have gotten out without a $5,000 loan from John Lennon. That article alone, which talked about the rise of Nixon to power and its release, was sufficient reason to kill Lennon. And there were, in fact, we know now, documented by Mr. Wenner in his book Come Together, extended attempts to both surveil, set up, discredit Lennon, and to eventually deport him. And he had to fight the deportation in court based on a charge that otherwise would have been a misdemeanor, small amount of marijuana, that he was busted for. But this was a pattern that went throughout that period, and there were attempts also by these forces to replace then the mind-expanding drugs with the soporifics, or drugs cut with poisons like acid with strychnine in the streets. There were attempts to have a counter to the Woodstock experience, which was positive for the generation, by setting up Altamont, so that a counter to the music of the Beatles, which was expansive and hopeful and talked about love and peace, was the music of the Rolling Stones, which was brutal and sexist and racist in its intent. And but even the Rolling Stones have been put in a bind by an American CIA agent, according to Mr. Scaduto in his book about the Stones, who brought a whole briefcase full of drugs into their apartment a few moments before British narcotics agents ran in and busted them and basically had them over the barrel. They were brought here to the United States before their first tour and stayed at the DuPont family home in New Jersey, these large munitions makers, and were given whatever drugs or women that they wanted, and were positioned, I believe, as a sort of negative counterforce to the positive music of the Beatles. And it was the Rolling Stones, in the midst of playing Sympathy for the Devil at the Altamont concert, who framed the murder with that song of the individual there that began the violence right at the scene. This was, I believe, one of many attempts to discredit the counterculture. Another I worked on, which involved top-level military intelligence people, was the Manson Family scenario, which was to give you the idea that if you lived separately as hippies and communes, that you'd turn into slavering, acid-free murderers and kill ordinary people. And so for many years, the last hippie that anybody was allowed to see on television was Charles Manson. They were very frightened by the implications of a counterculture that would withdraw the addictive needle of consumption and money dependence from their arm and live independently and share things. And Lennon, I think, represented one element of that was very frightening to them. Now, for a long period, Lennon was silent. Indications are that he was using drugs himself during that period. He didn't make any albums for a period of almost 5 years. He wasn't doing this political work. The constant surveillance and harassment around the deportation and the other COINTELPRO activities seemed to have backed him off and shaken him to the point that he abandoned the political work. But right around 1980, he released his first new album in many years, Double Fantasy, and he was renewing his interest in getting music out. And he was a powerful voice, even in those years. His popularity had not been forgotten. He was someone who, Mae Brussel, the researcher, said, I think rightly, could have, with just a public call, brought 1 million people out into the streets on behalf of a cause. And so he was a voice that I think they could ill afford to have at a time when Reagan was first elected and when the idea was to build up the massive military-industrial complex and to begin interventions into other countries, which Carter would not have done, but began these military invasions and other things that Lennon was likely to oppose. And I think that frames the timing and the motive for Lennon's murder much more than does some attempt by Chapman to make himself famous. Once you understand that there could be a political motive or a reason to kill Lennon, the next question is who is Mark David Chapman, and what is his background? And that's another thing that the media have not looked at.